Hi guys, today we are going to talk about the last topic in this chapter, which is solids. So we've spent a whole chapter on gases, we spent most of this chapter on liquids, and now we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so on solids. Solids don't get as much respect in chem because in order for a chemical reaction to occur, remember, particles have to collide together, and in solids the particles are vibrating in place, and so they're not able to collide very much. So in the next chapter we're going to talk about taking solids and dissolving them in water, making solutions, and then they're able to react. So the main difference between gases, liquids, and solids is the intermolecular forces. In gases, particles are so spread apart that those intermolecular forces are not really significant at all. In liquids, the particles are condensed, so now the intermolecular forces are significant, and they do affect properties like viscosity and surface tension, volatility, and all kinds of stuff. In order to get liquid to evaporate, you need to overcome these intermolecular forces, and these attractions between the particles turn them into a gas. In solids, particles are attracted even more with stronger intermolecular forces because now the particles are in this nice lattice crystal, and they are stuck in their place because of the strong attractions. And so in order to melt a solid, you need to overcome these attractions to break that crystal to allow the particles to move around each other and become a liquid. Let's review some properties of solids. They retain their own shape, they retain their own volume. So they retain their own volume because they are condensed already. Not very much space between them, so they're not compressible. They retain their own shape because they are vibrating in their place. And of course, they don't diffuse and they don't flow. So there are two main types of solids. We have amorphous solids and we have crystalline solids. Most solids make crystals, so that we call them crystalline, and that means they're neat and organized and in repeating patterns, very high order. But there are some solids that are amorphous, which means they are random. So amorphous solids are things that you can think of that are not very good at retaining their shape very well. Things like plastics or rubber or kind of like wax or glass. Those are examples of amorphous solids, which means their particles are not in very high order. Their particles are kind of arranged randomly. So again, we have the two main types of solids. We have amorphous, which means they are random, and then we have crystalline, which are most of the solids, and that means that they are very ordered in a nice crystal. Within crystalline, we have three different types. We have crystalline metallic, crystalline ionic, and crystalline molecular. So really we have four types of solids: amorphous, and then crystalline metallic, crystalline molecular, and crystalline ionic. So we've talked about amorphous. Now let's talk about these three crystalline solids. So a crystalline solid could be an ionic crystalline solid. An example of that would be something like NaCl or Kf or Na2SO4. So any ionic compound would form a crystalline solid. Because it's ionic, it's made up of ions. So if you have NaCl, for example, ions make up the crystal. So you have Na pluses and Cl minuses. They are bonded together ionically, and the attractions between the particles, what keeps this crystal together, is these ionic interactions. So the attraction between the negative chloride ion and the positive sodium ion, because there's full positives and full negatives, they attract each other. So the intermolecular forces between them are ionic interactions. Those are very, very strong because, again, you have full positives and full negatives. And so that causes these ionic substances to have very high melting points. We know that all ionic substances are solid at room temperature, and to get them to melt, you need a very high melting point. Also, ionic substances conduct when they are dissolved or molten. So if I were to take some solid salt and stick a conductivity tester in there, it would not conduct. But once I add water to it and dissolve it, the ions are able to dissociate and move around, and now you have positives and negatives separated, and when you have separation of charge, that allows for the flow of electrons. So for each of these solids, you need to have an example. You need to know what type of intermolecular forces there are, and then some properties. The next crystalline solid are molecular crystalline solids. Molecular is another word for covalent. So it's made out of molecules. Covalent substances are made out of molecules. So examples of that would be ice, or dry ice, which is solid CO2, sugar. And these are covalently bonded substances, and so their nuclei share an electron cloud. And for their intermolecular forces, they have one of the three types that we've talked about, so London dispersion, dipole interactions, or hydrogen bonding. These three different types of intermolecular forces are much, much weaker than ionic interactions. And so covalently bonded solids have much weaker intermolecular forces, and therefore they have much lower melting points. So ice, we already know that water, has a pretty low melting point. It's already a liquid at room temperature. Dry ice, which is CO2, it has already melted and vaporized at room temperature. Sugar is a solid at room temperature, but we can very easily melt it. And so they have very low melting points compared to ionic substances. Also, because you don't have any positives or negatives, those do not allow for conductivity of electricity at all. The third type of crystalline solids are metallic crystalline solids. So these are metals. So examples would be like copper or sodium or iron. So if you remember from our bonding chapter, metallic bonding occurs between atoms of the same metal. So if I have a chunk of copper, the copper atoms in there are bonded metallically. And what happens is these atoms lose some electrons to become stable, so they become cations. But there's nowhere for those electrons to go, so we have this sea of delocalized electrons. And this sea of delocalized electrons causes a lot of unique properties for metals. Things like, metals being malleable. Because of the sea of electrons, the cations can kind of slide around. They conduct electricity because the sea of electrons allows for flow of electrons. They have luster. They have high melting points. So all these are because of that sea of electrons and the attraction between the electrons and the cations. So to review the four different types, we have amorphous, which are random. Then we have crystalline ionic, crystalline metallic, and crystalline molecular. So all these crystalline solids are made up of crystals, of course, and crystals have atoms or molecules arranged in a very orderly pattern, and it has these repeating units. A unit cell is the smallest representative unit of a crystal. So if you take a bunch of unit cells and put them all together, you make the whole crystal. So here's an example. This is NaCl, and so this is the big crystal. So if you take just one little unit of it, that is called a unit cell. And there are many different types of unit cells with different shapes. You have cubes and rectangulars and rhombuses and all kinds of different shapes, hexagonals. You do not need to memorize any of these shapes, but just be aware that there's different types. NaCl, which is our classic example, is simple cubic. So tonight at dinner, put some salt on your hand and look at it really closely. If you have a magnifying glass, use that. You'll see that each particle is a perfect cube. And when they mine salt, so when they get the salt out of mines, they come in these huge, big, perfectly cubic crystals or cubic chunks, and they cleave them. The last thing you need to know about solids, other than the four types and examples and properties and stuff like that, is that some solids have different allotropes. Some substances have different allotropes. So allotropes are when you have two or more different molecular forms of the same element in the same physical state. So a few of the elements have different allotropes. Sulfur has different allotropes. Carbon has different allotropes. And so we're going to look at the example of carbon. Carbon has a lot of different allotropes. The ones that are usually very well known are diamonds, which is the picture in A here, and graphite, which is B. But there's all kinds of different things. There's amorphous carbon, there's carbon nanotubes, so there's these atoms of carbon that are bonded intricately like this that make a shape of a tube. Now this is also, of course, in the nanoscale, but it makes like a nanoscale tube. They call them carbon nanotubes. We have buckyballs, named after Buckminster Fuller. And they kind of look like soccer balls, but they're made up of carbons that have different sizes. So this one's like 60 carbons, this one's 540 carbons. But again, they are in the nanoscale. They're used a lot in medicine and things like that. But like you can see, there is a variety of different ways that these carbon atoms are arranged and bonded together, and that causes different properties for these allotropes. So all of these are just pure carbon, yet they have very different properties. For example, diamonds have these 3D intricate shape, and that is why it is extremely hard to break a diamond. The really expensive knives have diamond tips on them. Usually we use lasers now to cut diamonds because they're so hard to cut. Diamonds do not conduct electricity. They are very lustrous. All these properties are very different from graphite. Graphite is found in your pencil lead. So graphite is made up of these like flat sheets, and there's a bunch of sheets on top of each other. As you write with your pencil, those sheets come off on the paper, and so graphite is very soft. That's why it's easy to write with it. It is very brittle. You can easily break between these sheets. It is a semiconductor because the electrons can kind of float between these different layers and so on. So there's extremely different properties between the different allotropes, and yet they are all just carbon and they're all solid. So things that I could ask you about solids on the test. I could ask you what are the 4 different types. So you tell me amorphous, and then crystalline, molecular, crystalline, ionic, and crystalline, metallic, ionic, and molecular. I could ask you to give me an example of each of those 4. I could ask you to give me a property of each of those 4. I could ask you what are allotropes. So you tell me 2 or more different arrangement of atoms of the same element in the same physical state. I could ask you to give me an example of an allotrope. So the example that we've studied here is carbon. You could tell me it exists as graphite and diamond, or buckyballs and nanotubes, or something like that. All right, that's it for the chapter. I'll see you guys later. Bye.